Kohlberg's stages of moral development constitute an adaptation of a psychological theory originally conceived by the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget.Kohlberg began work on this topic while a psychology graduate student at the University of Chicago in 1958, and expanded and developed this theory throughout his life. The theory holds that moral reasoning, the basis for ethical behavior, has 6 identifiable developmental stages, each more adequate at responding to moral dilemmas than its predecessor. Kohlberg followed the development of moral judgment far beyond the ages studied earlier by Piaget, who also claimed that logic and morality develop through constructive stages. Expanding on Piaget's work, Kohlberg determined that the process of moral development was principally concerned with justice, and that it continued throughout the individual's lifetime, a notion that spawned dialogue on the philosophical implications of such research. The 6 stages of moral development are grouped into 3 levels: pre-conventional morality, conventional morality, and post-conventional morality. For his studies, Kohlberg relied on stories such as the Heinz dilemma, and was interested in how individuals would justify their actions if placed in similar moral dilemmas. He then analyzed the form of moral reasoning displayed, rather than its conclusion, and classified it as belonging to one of 6 distinct stages. There have been critiques of the theory from several perspectives. Arguments include that it emphasizes justice to the exclusion of other moral values, such as caring, that there is such an overlap between stages that they should more properly be regarded as separate domains, or that evaluations of the reasons for moral choices are mostly post hoc rationalizations of essentially intuitive decisions. Nevertheless, an entirely new field within psychology was created as a direct result of Kohlberg's theory, and according to Hageblum et al., a study of the most eminent psychologists of the 20th century, Kohlberg was the 16th most frequently cited psychologist in introductory psychology textbooks throughout the century, as well as the 30th most eminent overall. Kohlberg's scale is about how people justify behaviors, and his stages are not a method of ranking how moral someone's behavior is. There should, however, be a correlation between how someone scores on the scale and how they behave, and the general hypothesis is that moral behavior is more responsible, consistent and predictable from people at higher levels. Stages. Kohlberg's 6 stages can be more generally grouped into 3 levels of 2 stages each: pre-conventional, conventional and post-conventional, following Piaget's constructivist requirements for a stage model, as described in his theory of cognitive development. It is extremely rare to regress in stages, to lose the use of higher stage abilities. Stages cannot be skipped, each provides a new and necessarily perspective, more comprehensive and differentiated than its predecessors but integrated with them. Level 1-1. Obedience and punishment orientation. 2. Self-interest orientation. Level 2-3. Interpersonal accord and conformity. 4. Authority and social order maintaining orientation. Level 3-5. Social contract orientation. 6. Universal ethical principles. The understanding gained in each stage is retained in later stages, but may be regarded by those in later stages as simplistic, lacking in sufficient attention to detail. Pre-conventional. The pre-conventional level of moral reasoning is especially common in children, although adults can also exhibit this level of reasoning. Reasoners at this level judge the morality of an action by its direct consequences. The pre-conventional level consists of the first and second stages of moral development and is solely concerned with the self in an egocentric, manner. A child with pre-conventional morality has not yet adopted or internalized society's conventions regarding what is right or wrong, but instead focuses largely on external consequences that certain actions may bring. In stage 1, individuals focus on the direct consequences of their actions on themselves. For example, an action is perceived as morally wrong because the perpetrator is punished. The last time I did that I got spanked, so I will not do it again. The worse the punishment for the act is, the more bad the act is perceived to be. This can give rise to an inference that even innocent victims are guilty in proportion to the suffering. It is egocentric, lacking recognition that others' points of view are different from one's own. There is deference to superior power or prestige. An example of obedience and punishment-driven morality would be a child refusing to do something because it is wrong and that the consequences could result in punishment. For example, a child's classmate tries to dare the child to skip school. The child would apply obedience and punishment-driven morality by refusing to skip school because he would get punished. Stage 2 expresses the "what's in it for me" position, in which right behavior is defined by whatever the individual believes to be in the best interest, but understood in a narrow way which does not consider one's reputation or relationships to groups of people. Stage 2 reasoning shows a limited interest in the needs of others, but only to a point where it might further the individual's own interests. As a result, concern for others is not based on loyalty or intrinsic respect, but rather a "you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours" mentality. The lack of a societal perspective in the pre-conventional level is quite different from the social contract, as all actions at this stage have the purpose of serving the individual's own needs or interests. For the stage 2 theorist, the world's perspective is often seen as morally relative. An example of self-interest driven is when a child is asked by his parents to do a chore. The child asks, "What's in it for me?" The parents offer the child an incentive by giving a child an allowance to pay them for the chores. The child is motivated by self-interest to do chores. The conventional level of moral reasoning is typical of adolescents and adults. To reason in a conventional way is to judge the morality of actions by comparing them to society's views and expectations. The conventional level consists of the third and fourth stages of moral development. Conventional morality is characterized by an acceptance of society's conventions concerning right and wrong. At this level, an individual obeys rules and follows society's norms even when there are no consequences for obedience or disobedience. Adherence to rules and conventions is somewhat rigid, however, and a rule's appropriateness or fairness is seldom questioned. In stage 3, the self enters society by conforming to social standards. Individuals are receptive to approval or disapproval from others as it reflects society's views. They try to be a good boy or good girl to live up to these expectations, having learned that being regarded as good benefits the self. Stage 3 reasoning may judge the morality of an action by evaluating its consequences in terms of a person's relationships, which now begin to include things like respect, gratitude, and the golden rule. I want to be liked and thought well of. Apparently, not being naughty makes people like me. Conforming to the rules for one's social role is not yet fully understood. The intentions of actors play a more significant role in reasoning at this stage. One may feel more forgiving if one thinks that they mean well. In stage 4, it is important to obey laws, dictums, and social conventions because of their importance in maintaining a functioning reasoning society. Moral reasoning in stage 4 is thus beyond the need for individual approval exhibited in stage 3. A central ideal or ideals often prescribe what is right and wrong. If one person violates a law, perhaps everyone would. Thus, there is an obligation and a duty to uphold laws and rules. When someone does violate a law, it is morally wrong. Culpability is thus a significant factor in this stage as it separates the bad domains from the good ones. Most active members of society remain at stage 4, where morality is still predominantly dictated by an outside force. Post-conventional. The post-conventional level, also known as the principled level, is marked by a growing realization that individuals are separate entities from society, and that the individual's own perspective may take precedence over society's view. Individuals may disobey rules inconsistent with their own principles. Post-conventional moralists live by their own ethical principles that typically include such basic human rights as life, liberty, and justice. People who exhibit post-conventional morality view rules as useful but changeable mechanisms. Ideally, rules can maintain the general social order and protect human rights. Rules are not absolute dictates that must be obeyed without question, because post-conventional individuals elevate their own moral evaluation of a situation over social conventions. The behavior, especially at stage 6, can be confused with that of those at the pre-conventional level. Some theorists have speculated that many people may never reach this level of abstract moral reasoning. In stage 5, the world is viewed as holding different opinions, rights, and values. Such perspectives should be mutually respected as unique to each person in a community. Laws are regarded as social contracts rather than rigid edicts. Those that do not promote the general welfare should be changed when necessary to meet the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is achieved through majority decision and inevitable compromise. Democratic government is ostensibly based on stage 5 reasoning. In stage 6, moral reasoning is based on abstract reasoning using universal ethical principles. Laws are valid only insofar as they are grounded in justice, and a commitment to justice carries with it an obligation to disobey unjust laws. Legal rights are unnecessary, as social contracts are not essential for deontic moral action. Decisions are not reached hypothetically in a conditional way but rather categorically in an absolute way, as in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. This involves an individual imagining what they would do in another's shoes, if they believe what that other person imagines to be true. The resulting consensus is the action taken. In this way, action is never a means but always an end in itself. The individual acts because it is right, and not because it avoids punishment, is in the best interest, expected, legal, or previously agreed upon. Although Kohlberg insisted that stage 6 exists, he found it difficult to identify individuals who consistently operated at that level. Further stages. In Kohlberg's empirical studies of individuals throughout their life, Kohlberg observed that some had apparently undergone moral stage regression. This could be resolved either by allowing for moral regression or by extending the theory. Kohlberg chose the latter, postulating the existence of sub-stages in which the emerging stage has not yet been fully integrated into the personality. In particular, Kohlberg noted a stage 4.5 or 4+, a transition from stage 4 to stage 5 that shared characteristics of both. In this stage, the individual is disaffected with the arbitrary nature of law and order reasoning. Culpability is frequently turned from being defined by society to viewing society itself as culpable. This stage is often mistaken for the moral relativism of stage 2, as the individual views those interests of society that conflict with their own as being relatively and morally wrong. Kohlberg noted that this was often observed in students entering during college. Kohlberg suggested that there may be a seventh stage, transcendental morality, or morality of cosmic orientation, which linked religion with moral reasoning. Kohlberg's difficulties in obtaining empirical evidence for even a sixth stage, however, led him to emphasize the speculative nature of his seventh stage. Theoretical assumptions. Kohlberg's stages of moral development are based on the assumption that humans are inherently communicative, capable of reason, and possess a desire to understand others and the world around them. The stages of this model relate to the qualitative moral reasonings adopted by individuals, and so do not translate directly into praise or blame of any individual's actions or character, arguing that his theory measures moral reasoning and not particular moral conclusions. Kohlberg insists that the form and structure of moral arguments is independent of the content of those arguments, a position he calls formalism. Kohlberg's theory centers on the notion that justice is the essential characteristic of moral reasoning. Justice itself relies heavily upon the notion of sound reasoning based on principles. Despite being a justice-centered theory of morality, Kohlberg considered it to be compatible with plausible formulations of deontology in eudaimonia. Kohlberg's theory understands values as a critical component of the right. Whatever the right is, for Kohlberg, it must be universally valid across societies. There can be no relativism. Moreover, morals are not natural features of the world, they are prescriptive. Nevertheless, moral judgments can be evaluated in logical terms of truth and falsity. According to Kohlberg, someone progressing to a higher stage of moral reasoning cannot skip stages. For example, an individual cannot jump from being concerned mostly with peer judgments to being a proponent of social contracts. On encountering a moral dilemma and finding the current level of moral reasoning unsatisfactory, however, an individual will look to the next level, realizing the limitations of the current stage of thinking is the driving force behind moral development. As each progressive stage is more adequate than the last, the process is therefore considered to be constructive, as it is initiated by the conscious construction of the individual, and is not in any meaningful sense a component of the individual's innate dispositions, or a result of past inductions. Formal elements progress through Kohlberg's stages happens as a result of the individual's increasing competence, both psychologically and in balancing conflicting social value claims. The process of resolving conflicting claims to reach an equilibrium is called justice operation. Kohlberg identifies two of these justice operations: equality, which involves an impartial regard for persons, and reciprocity, which means a regard for the role of personal merit. For Kohlberg, the most adequate result of both operations is reversibility, in which a moral or dutiful act within a particular situation is evaluated in terms of whether or not the act would be satisfactory even if particular persons were to switch roles within that situation. Knowledge and learning contribute to moral development, specifically important to the individual's view of persons and their social perspective level, each of which becomes more complex and mature with each advancing stage. The view of persons can be understood as the individual's grasp of the psychology of other persons. It may be pictured as a spectrum, with stage 1 having no view of other persons at all, and stage 6 being entirely sociocentric. Similarly, the social perspective level involves the understanding of the social universe, differing from the view of persons in that it involves an appreciation of social norms. Examples of applied moral dilemmas. Kohlberg established the moral judgment interview in his original 1958 dissertation. During the roughly 45-minute tape-recorded semi-structured interview, the interviewer uses moral dilemmas to determine which stage of moral reasoning a person uses. The dilemmas are fictional short stories that describe situations in which a person has to make moral decision. The participant is asked a systemic series of open-ended questions, like what they think the right course of action is, as well as justifications as to why certain actions are right or wrong. The form and structure of these replies are scored and not the content. Over a set of multiple moral dilemmas, an overall score is derived. A dilemma that Kohlberg used in his original research was the Druggists Dilemma. Heinz steals the drug in Europe. Criticisms. One criticism of Kohlberg's theory is that it emphasizes justice to the exclusion of other values, and so may not adequately address the arguments of those who value other moral aspects of actions. Carol Gilligan has argued that Kohlberg's theory is overly androcentric. Kohlberg's theory was initially developed based on empirical research using only male participants. Gilligan argued that it did not adequately describe the concerns of women. Kohlberg stated that women tend to get stuck at level 3, focusing on details of how to maintain relationships and promote the welfare of family and friends. Men are likely to move on to the abstract principles, and thus have less concern with the particulars of who is involved. Consistent with this observation, Gilligan's theory of moral development does not focus on the value of justice. She developed an alternative theory of moral reasoning based on the ethics of caring. Critics such as Christina Hoff Sommers, however, argued that Gilligan's research is ill-founded, and that no evidence exists to support her conclusion. Kohlberg's stages are not culturally neutral, as demonstrated by its application to a number of different cultures. Although they progress through the stages in the same order, individuals in different cultures seem to do so at different rates. Kohlberg has responded by saying that although different cultures do indeed inculcate different beliefs, his stages correspond to underlying modes of reasoning, rather than to those beliefs. Another criticism of Kohlberg's theory is that people frequently demonstrate significant inconsistency in the moral judgments. This often occurs in moral dilemmas involving drinking and driving and business situations where participants have been shown to reason at a subpar stage, typically using more self-interest-driven reasoning than authority and social order obedience-driven reasoning. Kohlberg's theory is generally considered to be incompatible with inconsistencies in moral reasoning. Carpendale has argued that Kohlberg's theory should be modified to focus on the view that the process of moral reasoning involves integrating varying perspectives of a moral dilemma rather than simply fixating on applying rules. This view would allow for inconsistency in moral reasoning, since individuals may be hampered by their inability to consider different perspectives. Krebs and Denton have also attempted to modify Kohlberg's theory to account for a multitude of conflicting findings, but eventually concluded that the theory is not equipped to take into consideration how most individuals make moral decisions in their everyday lives. Other psychologists have questioned the assumption that moral action is primarily a result of formal reasoning. Social intuitionists such as Jonathan Haidt, for example, argue that individuals often make moral judgments without weighing concerns such as fairness, law, human rights, or abstract ethical values. Thus, the arguments analyzed by Kohlberg and other rationalist psychologists could be considered post hoc rationalizations of intuitive decisions. Moral reasoning may be less relevant to moral action than Kohlberg's theory suggests. continued relevance. Kohlberg's body of work on the stages of moral development has been utilized by others working in the field. One example is the defining issues test created in 1979 by James Rest, originally as a pencil and paper alternative to the moral judgment interview. Heavily influenced by the six-stage model, it made efforts to improve the validity criteria by using a quantitative test, the Likert scale, to rate moral dilemmas similar to Kohlberg's. It also used a large body of Kohlbergian theories such as the idea of post-conventional thinking. In 1999 the DIT was revised as the DIT-2. The test continues to be used in many areas where moral testing is required, such as divinity, politics, and medicine.